U.S. intelligence community. His assignments included Deputy Director of Central Intelligence from 1986 until 1989, and Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor at the White House from 1989 until 1991. During this period, he spent nearly 9 years at the National Security Council, the White House serving 4 presidents. As Director of Central Intelligence from 1991 to 1993, Dr. Gates was the only head of the CIA to ever risen to director from an entry-level position in the agency.
It is my honor this evening to welcome our 2011 Sylvanus Thayer Award winner, the Honorable Dr. Robert M. Gates. Dr. Gates' citation for this award and his biography are in your program, and my remarks will be brief. The Thayer Award is presented each year to someone who embodies selfless public service in accordance with the values of the United States Military Academy. We could ask for no finer example than Secretary Gates in a remarkable career in which he served for 8 presidents of the United States and for millions of soldiers and their families. Dr. Gates has always demonstrated bedrock integrity, exceptional professional competence, and unvarnished candor. Secretary Gates joined the Central Intelligence Agency in 1966 and spent nearly 27 years as an intelligence professional, the only career officer in CIA history to rise from entry-level employee to director. And during that period, he spent nearly 9 years with the National Security Council at the White House. As our Secretary of Defense, Dr. Gates was always focused on taking care of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines of the Armed Forces of the United States of America. His was the burden of the strategic decision-making that placed hundreds of thousands of troops in harm's way, and he always set the conditions for their success, and he never forgot their sacrifice. His time as our Secretary of Defense was one of continuity and change that included the stewardship of the national security strategy in the face of a dangerous and committed international terrorist threat, the strategic direction of the campaigns in both Afghanistan and Iraq, his uncompromising dedication to our wounded and to our families, the oversight of major shifts in the Department of Defense budget, and his team building with other chiefs of defense and heads of state worldwide. Dr. Gates has spoken here at West Point many times, from graduation at Michie Stadium to small classes in Lincoln Hall. And during every visit, he has affirmed his full support of our mission and his trust in our capacity to develop leaders of character. But tonight's event, this award, is about something different. For this award speaks to what may be his greatest achievement, an unwavering commitment on countless days to lead, to serve, to inspire the American soldiers who stand watch for our freedom around the world. Unparalleled service to the nation, a statesman of the first magnitude, and an extraordinary values-based leader. All of that defines the brilliant career of Dr. Robert M. Gates. Thank you, sir, and welcome back to West Point. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my privilege to introduce the chairman of the West Point Association of Graduates, Mr. Jody Glore, for the presentation of the 2011 Sylvanus Thayer Award.
General Huntoon, Margaret, Dr. Gates, other distinguished guests, and members of the Corps, thank you for welcoming your Association of Graduates into Washington Hall this evening. Corps of Cadets, that was one heck of a parade. Thank you very much for that great parade. Hooah! Great parade for a great person. Since 1958, the West Point Association of Graduates has recognized the service of 54 great Americans by presenting them the Thayer Award. Among the recipients have been scientists, astronauts, generals of the Army, distinguished members of the clergy, Supreme Court justices, presidents of the United States, and secretaries of state and defense. Each recipient has lived a life guided by the ideals of West Point's motto, duty, honor, country. Our guest of honor, Dr. Gates, most certainly belongs in this company of past Thayer Award recipients, not only for the overall character and magnitude of his service, but also for the personal interest he has taken in contributing to the development of the Corps of Cadets. Accordingly, it is my distinct pleasure to present the 2011 Sylvanus Thayer Award to Dr. Robert M. Gates. Sir, would you come on up?
Thank you, General Huntoon. Thank you, Mr. Glore. I want to express my appreciation to the West Point Association of Graduates for this great honor. And I would add also to the Corps of Cadets for that marvelous display of precision and discipline on the parade field a little while ago. Thank you for that. I want to mention especially three people who are here tonight, and I'm very honored by their presence. First, Secretary of Veterans Affairs, General Rick Shinseki. General, thank you for your service to our country. Second, Secretary of the Army, John McHugh, who joined me at the beginning of the Obama administration, two Republicans in strange territory. John's been a great partner, and I've really enjoyed working with him. And third, Admiral Joe Kernan. Admiral Kernan was my senior military assistant for almost 2 years. He was a commander of SEAL Team 6 and a commander of all the SEALs. I always wanted a warrior sitting outside my office. And so Joe's predecessor was then Lieutenant General Rod Rodriguez, and his predecessor was then Lieutenant General Pete Corelli. And they never let me forget the kids on the front line. So thank you for being here. So, y'all, so I'll eat like this every night? Maybe a little wine tasting on the side? I have to tell you, I approached today's event with a mix of great pride and also some apprehension because, unlike most Thayer Award recipient speakers, the Corps has seen and heard actually quite a lot from me over the last 4.5 years, most recently just last spring. As Defense Secretary, I made it a priority to set aside time in my schedule every year to hear from and speak to the next generation of military leaders at all the service academies. And it was time exceptionally well spent. Even so, I suspect that there may be an element of, oh, that guy again, especially when most of you have been up since oh dark 30, and I'm the only thing standing between you and some well-deserved personal time. During my visits here, whether in political science classes, lectures to the full Corps of cadets, or at a commencement address, I've had a chance to talk with you about principles of leadership, the importance of integrity and speaking truth to power, the future of warfare, and the role of the Army in a complex and dangerous and ever-changing world. That and tell jokes about the Pentagon and Washington, D.C. Every recipient of the Thayer Award is asked to offer some thoughts on the themes of duty, honor, country. And what I'd like to do during the next few minutes is focus on the country part of that trinity. In particular, the very special, yet fragile and increasingly distant relationship that exists between America and those who volunteered to defend her. As I prepared for today and I reflected on my time as Defense Secretary, I was struck by how so many of the senior military leaders I came to trust and rely on the most had either graduated from this institution or taught those who did. Names like Petraeus, Odierno, Corelli, Rodriguez, McChrystal, Dempsey, and others. These men are mostly known to you already, but I hope you will continue to learn and be inspired by what they accomplished for our country in the first major wars of the 21st century. It is also the case that the U.S. Army was at the center of my early decisions as Secretary of Defense, decisions that were so wrenching because of their effect on the lives of soldiers and their families, including surging 5 extra Army brigades to Iraq in January 2007, when so many had written off the war as lost, extending the length of Army combat deployments to 15 months to support the surge, and to mitigate the added stress on the force caused by those first 2 developments, increasing the size of the Army as well as the Marine Corps. The Iraq and Afghan campaigns represent the first protracted large-scale conflicts since our Revolutionary War to have been fought entirely by volunteers. A tiny sliver of America has achieved extraordinary things under the most trying circumstances. My hope and my expectation is that when all is said and done, our country's political leadership will continue to do right by the armed forces in their important budget decisions ahead. In fact, when I returned to Washington nearly 5 years ago, I was struck by how willing the Congress was at the time to approve almost any budget request relating to our men and women in uniform and their well-being on and off the battlefield. Indeed, one of the heartening things one sees today is the degree of affection, gratitude, and support accorded to troops and their families, a marked difference from the latter part of the Vietnam era. But make no mistake, funding is not the same as understanding. Sympathy is not the same as empathy. As I said at Duke University last year, for most Americans, our wars remain an abstraction, a distant and unpleasant series of news items that do not affect them personally. In the absence of conscription, a draft that reaches deeply down into the ranks of the citizenry, service in the military, no matter how laudable, in our country has become something for other people to do. Many prominent leaders and commentators inside and outside the military have remarked on this phenomenon. But what I would like to focus on tonight is the risk of a growing disconnect between our military and American society, not on the part of average Americans, but on the uniformed side of the equation. I would start with a couple of scene setters. On my last trip to theater as Defense Secretary, I visited a forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan. An NCO raised his hand and told me that he and others had signed up because the military, in his case the Marines, had a set of standards and values that is better than that of the civilian sector. He went on to ask if, in light of the pending repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, troops still adhering to what he described as better standards could opt out of their military enlistments early. My answer was no. This episode brought to mind a corridor display at the Pentagon, an exhibit dedicated to Army values. I assume you know them all. One of those things you're supposed to memorize at Beast Barracks and then recite on command. Loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage. But I was struck by the fact that the first panel introduces this list by saying that these values, and I quote, distinguish American soldiers from American society. Now, after a certain point in a military environment, one gets accustomed to this kind of language. But when you think about it, it is rather peculiar to suggest that attributes such as integrity, respect, and courage are not valued in the United States of America writ large. If you were able to spend enough time getting around this country, especially visiting successful organizations or close-knit communities, you would find that the 7 Army values are considered pretty important and being practiced across our great country and by Americans across the world. Just ask a policeman, a fireman, a teacher, a volunteer working in the inner city, or the families of AID workers, diplomats, journalists, or intelligence officers slogging away under dangerous or Spartan conditions overseas, or even people inside a well-run business. Of course, we're constantly bombarded with news of people and institutions across the country who fall short of those standards or ignore them altogether. On Wall Street, on Capitol Hill, Hollywood, all walks of life, public and private. But the military, like any large proud organization filled with fallible human beings is not itself immune to these shortcomings, whether in terms of morality or competence. Just think of the careerism and inertia that can infect middle layers of any bureaucracy, the disturbingly high rates of sexual harassment and assault that persist within the ranks, the tendency to hide or deflect unflattering information from superiors or the media, or the reality of poor, even toxic leadership by some officers at all levels. The real differentiator is that those who serve in uniform open themselves to physical danger and long separations from family. But it is off-putting to hear, even anecdotally, comments that suggest that the military is to some degree separate from and even superior to the society, the country it is sworn to protect. To some degree, this sense of separation is reinforced by a series of demographic, cultural, and institutional shifts that have made the American military, the troops you will command, less representative of the American people as a whole, mostly as a consequence of ending the draft. An all-volunteer military is, to a large degree, self-selecting. In this country, that propensity to serve is most pronounced in the South and the Mountain West, and in rural areas and small towns nationwide, a propensity that well exceeds these communities' proportion of the population as a whole. Concurrently, the percentage of the force from the Northeast, the West Coast, and major cities continues to decline. I'm also struck by how many young troops I meet who grew up in military families, and by the large number of our senior officers whose children are in uniform, and in many cases attending our service academies. The Army's own basing and recruiting decisions have reinforced this growing concentration, and to an increasing degree, isolation among certain regions and families. With limited resources, the services focus their recruiting efforts on candidates where they're most likely to have success, with those who have friends, classmates, and parents who have already served. In addition, global basing changes in recent years have moved a significant percentage of the Army to posts in just 5 states: Texas, Washington, Georgia, Kentucky, and North Carolina. For otherwise rational environmental and budgetary reasons, many military facilities in the Northeast and on the West Coast have been shut down, leaving a void of relationships and understanding in their wake. When it comes to officer recruitment and training, one study, for example, showed that the state of Alabama, with a population of less than 5 million people, has 10 Army ROTC host programs. By contrast, the Los Angeles metro area, population over 12 million, has 4. And the Chicago metro area, population 9 million, has 3. Now, it makes sense to focus on places where space is ample and inexpensive, where candidates are most inclined to sign up and pursue a career in uniform. However, there is a real risk over time of developing an officer cadre that is politically, culturally, and geographically having less and less in common with the majority of the people they have sworn to defend. Retired Lieutenant General David Barno, class of '76, and former commander of the international forces in Afghanistan, had some provocative comments to this effect earlier this year. Referring to the Army, he wrote, "Not only does it reside in remote fortresses, but in a world apart from the cultural, intellectual, and even geographic spheres that define the kaleidoscopic United States. This splendid military isolation, set in the midst of a largely adoring nation, risks fostering a closed culture of superiority and aloofness." My own view is that we're not close to getting there yet, but it does suggest that another important task for young Army leaders, for you, is to do what you can to keep yourself, through the assignments you take in your career and the choices you make in life, better connected to an American society of which you are an integral part. It is of particular importance to graduates of this institution, who, unlike your OCS and ROTC colleagues, will have been steeped in essentially a monastic military environment pretty much since leaving high school. Getting this relationship on a sound footing is so important because a civil-military divide can expose itself in an ugly way, especially during a protracted and frustrating war effort. I think one of the great achievements of the post-Vietnam Army leadership was preventing a corrosive, stabbed-in-the-back narrative from putting down roots within the service at a time when many officers were inclined to blame American society, the media, and politicians in particular for allegedly tying their hands and not seeing the effort through. When I came on board as Secretary of Defense, pretty much at the low point of the Iraq War, I worried about the recriminations, finger-pointing, and resentments already starting to crop up over a lack of support by civilian leaders and agencies, over a non-mobilized, disengaged civilian society. A situation that might have turned toxic if the U.S. military were to have experienced a humiliating retreat from Iraq. That was one of the reasons I challenged Army audiences early on to think about how the service's miscalculations and bureaucratic inclinations may have contributed to the problems we encountered in the post-9/11 campaigns. Of course, due to the incomparable ability of the Army to adapt both on the battlefield and on the institutional side, plus the extraordinary courage and determination of soldiers in theater, we turned the tide in Iraq and avoided the calamity that would have befallen our country, our Army, and the relationship between them. Tending to this relationship between soldier and society is something that military and civilian leaders alike must be cognizant of as we enter a delicate and difficult transition phase in the Afghanistan campaign, an effort of which the American public and increasing number of politicians have grown weary, even as so many of our military leaders believe we are finally on the right track. Now, I realize this is pretty heavy material for a ceremonial occasion, but I'm just not very good at fluff, and I suspect you're not very interested in fluff. But I hope my comments will stimulate some thought and some debate in the days and weeks ahead. Each of you, with your talents and intelligence and record of accomplishment, could have chosen something easier or safer and, of course, better paid. But you took on the mantle of duty, honor, country, passed down the long gray line. The men and women who walked these halls and strode these grounds before you. For that, you have the profound gratitude and eternal admiration of the American people. In my addresses to the service academies as Defense Secretary, I would usually close by saying that I felt as if each of the young men and women before me were like my own sons and daughters to me. Well, I still do. And I will until my last breath. Thank you for this great honor, and God bless.
Secretary Gates, on behalf of the Corps Cadets, we'd like to thank you for your words, your inspiration, and your leadership and service to our country. We hope you accept this token of our appreciation. Thank you very much, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing for the singing of our alma mater, led by the Cadet Glee Club. At the conclusion of the alma mater, please remain standing for the benediction. Ladies and gentlemen, Father Wood.
Will you pray with me? Eternal God, we've gathered in this place to honor your good servant, Robert Gates. We celebrate his life of distinction, and we thank you for his vibrant presence in the midst of your people. He has taught us that public office is a trust before it is an honor. It is a call to service, not to glory. It is not a measure of worthiness, but of willingness to try. And we've come to know him as a man of consummate honor, a man of deep dedication, a man in love with doing good. Bless him tonight and always, that he may endure as a bright light in our midst, a token of your presence, and a reminder that the truth shall always set us free. Bless us, too, as we leave this place. Restore our hope, strengthen our faith in you and in each other, and make us always and evermore men and women of duty, honor, country. Amen.
This concludes the 2011 Thayer Award ceremony. Thank you for attending this evening. I ask that our guests in the Corps remain at your tables while the official party departs.